Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on developing your child's high school IEP with Amy McDougall. Before we begin, a few notes about participation. My name is Andrea Lucy, and I'm the Chapter Membership Coordinator at PWSA USA. Your audio is muted when you joined the call. Questions can be submitted via the question box on your screen. There will be ample time for questions after the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and available on the PWSA USA YouTube channel. It is now my pleasure to welcome our presenter today. Amy, thank you so much for being with us. Please feel free to introduce yourself and let's get started.
All right. My name is Amy McDougall. I have the distinct privilege of being a PWS mom. My daughter Noelle is 18. She's actually a senior in high school this year. So really we're looking at developing IEPs right at the level that we're living at right now. Also professionally, I'm a school psychologist. So I have been working with kids preschool age through high school age for about 18 years now, and have really covered the gamut between chairing meetings, doing evaluations, crisis consultation, behavioral consultation. I frequently joke that I'm just a jack of all trades, master of none. So really what we'd like to do tonight is just take a look at those IEPs in high school. At this point in time, you've probably had a lot of experience going to meetings, dealing with writing IEPs. So in some respects, I'm going to gloss over some of the things that are probably going to seem like common knowledge, and really try and dive into some of those things that perhaps you hadn't considered, things that you might want to make sure that you go back and look at whether or not they're in your IEP. Just making sure that you feel like things are well designed for your child. And I apologize. There we go. For a moment there, my screen wasn't shifting. So my plan for this evening is really just to kind of touch quickly on what are the essential components of an IEP, what should definitely be in there, and then really dive into what would be more PWS specific needs that you want to make sure are included in the varied sections of the IEP. And really part of that includes being prepared for possible behavioral or discipline discussions and the transition to life after high school. So as I'm sure you're all aware, an IEP really is that written statement that includes everything that needs to be provided to meet your child's unique educational needs. So we're going to talk a lot about current levels of performance, where your child is at, how they're functioning in a bunch of different areas. Start thinking about special factors, which would include behavior, and what sort of interventions might be needed in that case, what goals should look like and how those should be written. And then all of that leads into, what services and related services you need in terms of whether it be teacher support, whether it be related services, whether it be supports for school personnel. Talk a little bit about participation with non-disabled children and transition planning. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment just to step back and think about a couple of things, because your responses to some of these questions are really going to define how you approach both the school staff and how you want to see things worded in your child's IEP. One of the first questions before you start diving into things are, what are your concerns and your biggest worries for your child? Those might be, behavioral, they might be academic. They might be PWS related medical concerns, but having a sense in your mind of what's important to you and what you're concerned about seeing your child be able to accomplish can really help to guide the conversation as you go into meetings. What would you like your child to be able to do in the short term? I think it's really important to remember that when you write that IEP, it should really be for just the coming year. And so having big, lofty goals that aren't really something that you're going to achieve in the next year is not necessarily productive. So you want to think about, where do you want to take those next steps? What's coming next? I think this next question is really a key one. Do you believe that hyperphagia is a behavior that can be trained away or a symptom of a biological drive? And the reason this is so important is because if you're going to characterize the hyperphagia and that desire for food as a behavior, what you're opening the door open to is consequences and potentially punishments for not following through on avoiding food. So it leaves it open to this idea of cognitive modifiability. which means that it's something that you expect to move past. But if you're really looking at the hyperphagia and that drive for food as a symptom of something that's biological, it's not something that you're going to be able to move past, then you start having a lot more discussions about how do you support your child, how do you structure their environment, how do you make sure that they remain safe and they learn how to function within that. So it becomes more about environmental modification versus potentially punishment. Do I believe that my child will be fully independent, or they're likely always going to need some level of support? This is a huge question as well, because once you get into high school, those discussions, the whole goal is to have your child be a functioning, independent adult. That's what the goal is for every child that has an IEP. The reality is that a lot of our PWS kids are always going to need some sort of support. So I think that you want to make sure that you bear that in the back of your mind. So when you're writing goals and when you're making plans and you're talking about transition, you're always talking about what supports you think they're going to need in the long term versus laying the burden essentially on them of expecting them to be fully self-sufficient. It can really drive some questions. And for example, with my own daughter, you know, she's doing phenomenally well. She can do a lot of things on her own, but the reality is we have a locked kitchen. She has a one-to-one with her throughout the day. And so those are things that we anticipate that she's always going to need. She's always going to need to have a locked kitchen. She's always going to need support. So if we're writing goals for her to be able to independently cook, to plan a menu, to be able to use public transportation without any supervision. Those are things that really could realistically put her at risk, and they're not appropriate goals for your child. So the goals should much more be about accessing supports, knowing what she needs, being able to advocate for herself. Those would be more appropriate goals to discuss in terms of transition. And then when you start thinking about it, really you want to think about describing all of it in a way that's relevant to classroom instruction. Even though Prader-Willi is a pervasive syndrome, it impacts us in numerous ways in how we live our lives. The reality is that the school's always going to be focused on education first. And so we always want to think about how is Prader-Willi going to impact their classroom functioning, and how is it going to play out in that way? Because the teacher's primary goal is to have your child learn knowledge and be ready to graduate. And so anything that you talk about, you really want to think about how it's going to impact them and being able to achieve that goal. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit further. So when you look at the IEP, the basis of their IEP is really what they call the present levels. And the present levels really focus in on where is your child at right now, what are their strengths and interests, and what needs do they have. And so there's 4 different areas that they really focus in on with present levels. And the information in these sections should drive everything else about the IEP. So the first section is academic achievement and learning. And for most kids, you know, that's their reading, their writing, their math, how they're doing with those different things academically. And you should certainly talk about, you know, their skills and strengths in those areas and what their needs are. But there's a couple other things that are really can be relevant. Speech. How clearly can they, you know, be understood? Can they express themselves? Do other people know what they're saying? Or do they need something to help them through there? Their language skills. Do they understand what's being said to them? Do they need to have things simplified, modified, repeated? Are they able to express themselves, or do they need to have somebody kind of guide them along in how they're expressing it? Some kids can have a lot of information in their heads, but if they can't express it well, then people aren't going to even know what they're aware of, and they need help to help kids show their knowledge. And then some of those more like soft skills for learning, those functional skills like attention. Is your kid going to be completely distracted and zoned out? Are they going to be looking around? Are they going to be able to participate in a discussion? The ability to participate in adult-directed tasks. Some of our kids, if they've got an idea in their head, that's what they're focused on, and they're not necessarily following along with what the rest of the group is doing. So having strategies in place to address that is important, or that ability to remain engaged. What you know about your kid could really help to guide people along. Like, for example, you know, we had written into our IEP at one point in time that it's important to ensure that Noelle is attending prior to giving instructions, either by getting her attention or by asking afterwards if she understands what is expected. Now, in Noelle's case, we might have said, you can't just say, do you know what you need to do? Because the answer will always be yes. But when you say to her, explain to me what you need to do, that strategy is something that really gives somebody a good idea of whether she does understand or not. So those are the sorts of things that you might want to think about in terms of how your child interacts with learning in addition to their skills. Social development is really a huge one. I know that, oftentimes our kids, their social skills aren't as strong, their awareness, they might not really feel connected with some of their peers. And while all those things are really important, there's a couple other things to really consider when we're thinking about an IEP and how things might go in a classroom. I've listed off a couple of different things. I mean, obviously the ability to cope with frustration or their emotional regulation can be huge. Is your kid a go with the flow sort of kid? Or if they're feeling frustrated with the work, will they leave the room? Will they rip the paper to shreds? Will they cry? Will they, are they able to just say, I don't know what to do? So having strategies in place to cope with their behaviors when they're struggling, or even prevent those behaviors by doing things at their level, or prepping them ahead of time, are huge. Food anxiety is one that I really make sure that I emphasize whenever we're having conversations at school, because the reality is that for those kids who are really struggling with significant hyperphagia, that food anxiety can completely interfere with their ability to attend. One example I've given a lot of times with teachers, and they typically seem to respond very well, is we talk about whether or not teachers don't enjoy being observed. It's part of our evaluation process. It's not fun. And it's anxiety producing. But every teacher that I've ever known says that they would way rather have an announced observation, because they know when the person's coming in to observe them, they know what to expect. They can plan for what they're going to be doing at that point in time, versus an unannounced observation where you have no idea when the person might walk in, what the kids might be doing, who might be throwing the classroom out of whack, whether your lesson's going to be going well. And I really make a parallel between that and food anxiety by saying that if a kid with Prader-Willi knows what to expect, whether or not there's going to be food, they're much more focused. It's like that announced observation. They're ready to go. They feel on their game. But if they have no idea when there might be a food exposure, they're going to spend all their time focused on when there might be food, whether or not they might get any, how that's going to play out. And so they're spending all their time thinking about that versus thinking about academics. So as Prader-Willi parents, we obviously are just concerned about the food anxiety, but when you think about the significant impact it could have on a kid's ability to attend and participate, it obviously has a huge educational impact. Then you start looking at perseverative behaviors, that questioning over and over again, the need to have things the same way, the kid who can't handle substitutes. If something changes during the day, they're just not going to be able to function. So those needs for structure, routine, and consistency, how they interact with others, all of those things can really impact their ability to participate in a classroom environment. Obviously, the list is lengthy in terms of the physical development concerns for individuals with Prader-Willi. I've listed off a bunch of them, and as you go down through them, you could certainly see where any of these things could impact a classroom. Obviously, you don't necessarily worry as much about the motor skills when you get to high school, but the reality is if you have low tone, you might not be able to sit up throughout the classroom day to be able to pay attention. Your handwriting might be poor, and you might need to learn how to type and access those sorts of things, or augmentative communication. Signs of illness, certainly something that we've included, and it really seems even more prevalent, now in the midst of COVID. But if our kids don't show illness the same way, it's important for people to understand when they might want to call and get a hold of you. So for example, in Noelle's IEP, we had always written about the fact that she didn't run fevers, she doesn't vomit. So there was no way of really knowing if she was becoming ill. So we had written in about the fact that, if she reaches a temperature of, really for her, if she had hit 100, that was a fever, or if she blanched suddenly, or for her, increased food seeking was a sign of illness. So we had included in those things so people knew what to look for, so they were able to contact us if there was an issue. Daytime sleepiness obviously has an impact on the ability to participate and attend. We talked a little bit about the hyperphagia, the food seeking, and just you start talking about all those different things that can impact kids during the class and might make them stand out. So it's important to look at ways to kind of address some of those things so it's not necessarily as noticeable to their peers. Management is a huge one because you start thinking about, how does my child's environment need to be different for them to be successful? You know, when they're in elementary school, you just kind of think about, well, it would be great if there was an extra person in the room. But once you get up to that secondary level, you start talking about things like supervision. You know, you've got hallways in between classes, you've got locker rooms where it's typically against the law to have any adults in the locker room for different reasons and confidentiality and stuff like that. So pretty much any unstructured setting without supervision could absolutely become problematic for a child with Prader-Willi. In our case, one of the things that we had talked about in terms of management is, number one, Noelle has a one-to-one with her throughout the day, but then her access to the hallway, she knew would be very difficult because kids tended to eat in the, you know, in the hallways, and there was other things going on. So we had worked it out where she would leave her classes 2 minutes early so that she was able to navigate the hallways without all of the additional food exposure. She was able to, you know, motor wise, at one point in time, it was harder for her to really get from class to class. So it was easier for her to do that without other kids bumping and pushing. So having strategies for that is really important. Consistency between adults, including communication with substitutes. Absolutely a huge one, especially at the secondary level. When you think about the fact that our kids are masters at analyzing an environment and knowing when somebody might be on their game or not, having discrepancies between adults and how they're handling things opens up opportunities to play adults against one another and create situations where food could easily be accessible or behaviors might be more likely. So making sure that the adults are all on the same page, they have a plan. We had actually had a note in all the subfolders that basically said, you know, there's a student with you know, some significant food issues and behavior management needs in the classroom. You know, there should be no food in the classroom, and here's who to talk to be able to get more information. So because, excuse me, PWS is simply too complex to try and give a full explanation in a note to a substitute, but if there's a plan to give them a heads up and then tell them who they can go to, that's really important. Thinking about use of food in instruction. When they're younger, it's all about the rewards, but as they get older, activities, labs. I know that one of my daughter's science teachers had a lab that they did every year that revolved around the cell, but the way they set it up used Jello and things floating in the Jello, and it was just a bunch of food right in front of her. Or trying to talk about how to, you know, some of even the math problems that they were using had them planning out a menu and what kind of grocery shopping they needed to do. And we had to have a discussion about what can you do differently, because that exposure to food is not going to be teaching the lesson you want it to. And it's really going to end up becoming a distraction versus a teaching modality. Peer access to food is another huge one at the secondary level. I know in our school, a lot of times kids didn't necessarily have lunch because they were filling up their schedule, so they were bringing food to class. We live in a relatively low socioeconomic district, so we provided breakfast and lunch. And certainly you don't want kids to go without. So we had some discussions about, you know, her exposure to food and what that might look like and how they would restrict it in certain classes. When we talked with the teachers, we said, let's be realistic. you're better off in the classes that she's in saying that there's not going to be any food, but you're going to want to start the school year like that, because if you start to allow food in your classroom and then you lock down on it and say that there's not going to be, number one, you're pointing out to everyone that there's somebody with a disability, and it may cause some hard feelings. But two, you're probably going to have some behavioral problems with the kids who felt like a privilege has been taken back away from them. So we had really focused on having a clear plan ahead of time. And then we described the fact that, if there was food in the classroom, that it should certainly be secured in a location out of her reach. We had talked about the fact that she needed to be monitored. In Noelle's case, her one-to-one wouldn't let her go into the bathroom without removing the garbage can first, because she had been known to take food out of garbage cans when she went into the bathroom to use it. So in terms of special events, a lot of times there are, rewards or incentives and things like that. Certainly important to have discussions about alternatives that are non-food related, or if there was going to be something that would involve food, either, what could she do differently, or whether they could come up with things that were different for everybody else. And then communication with home. How do you establish that sort of communication? How are they going to let you know? How are they going to get in touch with you? Because it's certainly important. So I think those are a lot of the different things in terms of management. So then the reality is, then you start moving on to your present levels of functioning become the basis for the remainder of your IEP. So thinking about goals. So when you wrote those present levels, they should be talking about what your child needs, whether it's an academic skill, a social skill, that you should know where you're headed and what they need to work on. And so the goals should really just align with whatever those areas of need are in the present levels. So it should be kind of like, here's the need, here's where we're going and what we want to do about it. You should really know goals should be clear, so you know how they've achieved it. You don't want it to be nebulous where it could mean something to something different to anybody. I've seen goals where it says that they'll behave appropriately within a classroom setting. What does appropriate mean? Are you looking for, listening skills? Are you looking for no outbursts? Are you looking for asking questions and participating in the class? You want to make sure that you know exactly what needs to happen for your child to say, yes, I have achieved this goal. You want to talk about the services, the modifications, the supports for school personnel to help make sure that the child meets those goals. Services are relatively straightforward. You're typically talking about teacher services and then related services, sometimes counseling or things of that nature. Modifications are more about how are you going to change their environment? What are you going to do differently? What can you do? Whether it's, say, use of a calculator or use of a device where you can type, asking questions more than once, restating things, having a one-to-one aide to make sure that they always have supervision. Supports for school personnel are not something that are specifically targeted to provide your child with a service, but it's all about supporting the school personnel and knowing what they need to do. So we have really ensured that over time, we have consistently included in Noelle's IEP a statement that there will be disability-specific training on a yearly basis at the beginning of the year, where we get together and we talk about what is Prader-Willi syndrome, how is it going to impact her in the classroom. We do some Q&A. We really prep everybody, give them a chance to ask questions, but because they've had that conversation before the start of the year and we've made it more personal, it helps them feel ready to go into the school year. And a lot of times you hear people talking about the least restrictive environment. And certainly whenever we write an IEP, the goal is always to have our student be able to do as much as they can as possible with students that don't have disabilities, and to not be piling on services. That being said, you have to look at your child individually. And for some kids, being in that typical classroom is just going to simply be too overwhelming. They're not going to be gaining what they need academically, and it's just not going to be a good fit. So really the goal is to look at where your child is, how they're functioning, what your long-term goals are for them, and then think about what sort of classroom is best going to get them there. Certainly for some kids, it's a classroom that's focused on those college prep, but with some special education teacher support to help modify things. For other kids, it's going to be a much more restrictive environment, like a special class where it's just students with disabilities with really significant needs, and they might be focusing on life skills and just, doing things that seem very functional. Any of those environments are appropriate if they're meeting your child's needs. And I think that it's always important to remember that for our kids with Prader-Willi, cognitively, they might look like they're doing pretty well, but the reality is that if their behavior has gotten to the point where it's completely interfering with their ability to benefit from instruction in those less restrictive environments, then do they really have the ability to participate in the class because the behavior is interfering? So I'm never going to weigh in on one level of support versus another without talking about where a child is at individually. In terms of transition planning, so once you're in high school, the federal government mandates that transition planning is a part of every IEP for the academic year when the student's going to turn 16. Now, different states have different dates. I know in New York, it's 15. We have to be prepped and ready to go. But transition really focuses on thinking about you're eventually going to have a time when, and I love this phrase, the bus is going to stop coming. You're going to get to a point where you're going to be moving on to either, some sort of vocational education, college, supported employment, adult services, moving into a group home. But education in terms of, traditional public school education is no longer going to be an option. And so you need to plan for that. So when you're planning on that, the planning really revolves around looking at, what are your child's strengths? What are their interests? What are they good at? What's something that where they might really be able to feel like they're going to have some sort of meaningful, whether it be employment or activity in their adult life. And then the goal is to start talking about what do we need to do to get them there? What's our plan? So you need to develop goals that are going to talk about, do they need training in a certain area? Do they need to learn how to even access different opportunities? Do they need to learn how to, punch a time card? Do they need to learn how to write a resume? Do they need to learn how to use public transportation? Do they need to learn how to function in a group home? Whatever it is that you're looking at your child's level of independence. And I really prefer for our kids thinking about interdependence because for example, my daughter can do a heck of a lot for herself. I am always going to be the backup to make sure that she's safe. But what can she do within that structure? Because she can do a lot as long as I keep the supports in place and the structures in place. You're really going to want to know your state-specific options as you have these conversations. There's diplomas. Some states have a higher level of diploma based on more college prep. They have local diplomas. There's credentials where really they almost compile of skills that they've mastered and things that they can do so that they could share that with an employer as they move forward rather than a diploma. So every state has something different. So it's really important as you're thinking about that eventual transition out of high school to talk about where do you envision your child being? Where do they envision their child being? How independent will they be within that setting? What sort of activities or employment might they have? And what do they need to do to start learning and prepping for that eventual move? Discipline is always the one that, is stressful because certainly our kids can come up with some pretty interesting ways to get themselves into trouble. So thinking about as you write the IEP, what sort of situations might become an issue. So I think it's really important to be clear that it's a misnomer that a student with a disability can't be suspended for violating the code of conduct. Um, Schools have those codes of conduct, and if your child violates them, they can absolutely be suspended. However, what comes next is the fact that whenever you have either a removal that totals 10 days or a pattern of referrals totaling 10 days. So they've been suspended a day at a time for the same behavior over and over or something very similar. The school district has to hold what's called a manifestation determination. And within that meeting, what they have to talk about is, was the behavior that resulted in the suspension caused by or has a relationship to their disability? Or did the school fail to follow a portion of the IEP, including a behavior intervention plan, which caused the misconduct? And if it is the case where there is a connection between your child's area of disability and the behavior that resulted in them getting suspended, then they can't continue to, have your child have further disciplinary consequences for what they did. They need to look at, is some sort of behavioral strategy more appropriate? What do they need to change? Is their program just not appropriate? They really need to look at what they did differently, because you can't continue to punish a child for a behavior that's a direct result of their disability. So when you think about that, and then you start thinking about Prader-Willi, I think it's really important to think about, making sure that there's a clear connection throughout your IEP in terms of what might be the most pressing issues that your child might have, so that should something happen, you have a very clear line drawn between that area of disability and potential behavior. So for example, Noelle absolutely has hyperphagia, and she is, without supervision, she would steal either money or food. Stealing is a violation of the code of conduct. Absolutely, she could be suspended for that. But if we have it throughout her IEP that Prader-Willi is biological, that she needs supervision, that she's driven to food seek, here are the different things she needs to support her and ensure that she doesn't have the opportunity to do that. If she was suspended for something like that and we had to sit down in a meeting, we could absolutely say, well, it's throughout her IEP that clearly you should have anticipated that this could be a problem because of her Prader-Willi. What are you going to do differently? Are you going to change her program? Are you going to change the amount of adult support she has? Are you going to provide a behavior plan? But as long as there's that clear line, they can't keep going. They need to come up with something different. And this is where a lot of times you see conversations like on social media about programs that aren't, supporting kids, and their parents feel that they belong in a residential program and the school's not following through. If you have all these things laid out throughout your IEP and your child's having disciplinary issues because of them, then there is absolutely grounds to push for a change in placement or additional support. So I think it's, and I totally lost my train of thought, and I will probably come back to that in a moment. But, I know what it was. Whenever your child is removed from an educational setting, so say your child comes into school first thing in the morning and they call you and they're like, look, your kid's a hot mess today, we're sending him home. That is a removal from an educational setting. If they take them down to given instruction, that is a removal. So if you start having little half days here and half days there, those should be included in looking at that 10-day tally. So it's not appropriate for a school to just be calling and asking parents to bring their kids home. That's still a removal, and it's something that needs to be considered. And if it's happening on a regular basis, the school should absolutely be having a manifestation to talk about what they should be doing differently. In terms of practical advocacy, there's a couple of things that I always suggest to parents as you look at everything and try and build relationship. When you're going into a meeting, I always talk about what's your gold standard and what's your acceptable fallback. I think so often we think that we know what our kids need and we are adamant that it's going to be that way and you're not going to take anything less. The reality is the school is bound to what they call FAPE, which is a free and appropriate public education. It's not free and best possible education. The word is appropriate. So what I always do is when I'm going into a meeting, I know what do I really want? What do I think is the best possible option for Noelle? And in the back of my mind, I have, here's what I could accept. Here's what I could be okay with. So that if I'm not able to achieve what I think would be absolutely perfect for her, I can still look like I'm working with a district in a way that I can feel comfortable with. So an example might be when Noelle was first entering public education, I really wanted a one-to-one for her. And I was adamant that I wanted that person throughout the day. But I knew it might be difficult because getting one-to-ones can be difficult, especially when your child is brand new to a school and they might not understand their disability. So in the back of my mind, I had said, you know what, I could be okay as long as she has extra adult support whenever she might be unsupervised or whenever there's food around. If she's in the classroom and there's no food and, things are going fine, I can be okay with that, but she absolutely has to be supervised in the hallways and in the lunchroom at snack time. Now, I had that in the back of my head. I didn't tell anyone that was in the back of my head, but I had it kind of stored away. I absolutely advocated for the full-time one-to-one and we got it, so I never had to let on. But what would have happened is if I had to go to my fallback position, I would have had questions prepared in terms of needing to have data collection and the time frame that we could look at it. So I would have, say I hadn't gotten that full-time one-to-one, and I probably would have said, okay, so here's what I want to know. I want to know how often within the classroom does she need to be redirected? How often do things need to be changed? How often is she dozing off? How often is she missing out on classroom instruction? And ask them to do data collection on that. And say, I'd really like to come back in like a month and talk about what sort of information you have, so that we can talk further about whether or not she needs additional adult support. So that, supervision is one thing. Another thought was I worked with another family where the school was adamant that they didn't want the child to have break periods to take a nap. And I said, well, okay, so they don't want to write into his IEP that he's going to get a nap. You absolutely need to tell the school district that you're asking for documentation of how many times he fell asleep in class, the length of time that he was actually asleep and missing out on instruction, and then ask what they were planning to do to make up the instruction that had been missed. So again, having that fallback, but with questions that are very specific about how can you keep track of the results of this decision and when are we going to come back to talk about that? Not just say, we'll keep track of it, but when are we going to talk again? I'm a huge proponent of making sure that you document everything. And really it's put it in writing. And these can be done in very nice ways. It could be a thank you note after a meeting where, perhaps it was that discussion about, I wanted to make sure that the student, they were looking at the possibility of whether or not he needed a nap. And we had talked about, tracking his classroom engagement. I might follow up with an email saying, thank you so much for talking about this the other day. I appreciate that you're planning to look at and laying out all the different things that they were saying that they would, progress monitor or track, and say, I'm looking forward to meeting with you at such and such a date based on our discussion. That way it's nice. It reminds people that you're on top of things, but yet it's very clear that should there ever be a time where there's a difference of opinion about what was discussed in a meeting, you've got it in writing what the discussion was about. Also huge on saying, have you fostered communication in advance? So often schools and parents end up having some negative interactions because the school feels like they're being expected to do certain things and they can't tell a parent if there's a problem. And I think that is one of the most detrimental things to our kids is if we don't have clear communication. Because they're, again, like we talked about earlier, they are masters at working a situation. And if there's not clear communication, things could get dropped. So one of the things I've really done is when I do my training at the beginning of the year, I actually am the one who goes in and trains for my child and lays out her syndrome and everything else. I share a situation and I tell a story about a time where obviously I'm a pretty good person at being able to provide a lot of structure and support and keeping Noelle out of food, but I share about a situation where she absolutely played me. And she got access to something. And I talk about the fact that, if I'm this good at it and I've got this much experience and she can play me, she's going to play you at some point in time. And it's so much better for all of us if you could just let me know when something like that happens or if you make a mistake. Not because I want to criticize you, but I just want to talk about what we can do to move forward. Number one, so that I can keep her safe and so that she doesn't think that she can, have something like that happen again. It will improve her concentration because she knows that you're going to take care of it and we're all going to work together. Obviously, there will be situations where that might not work, but certainly promoting communication and acknowledging that you're going to listen and work together versus judge can be huge in making sure that your child is successful. That being said, remember, like, as you go through this is a journey. And I think that as my child has gotten older, I've looked back at previous IEPs and thought, I really left out some stuff I should have had there earlier, or boy, I really didn't touch on this like I should have. There's always time to modify, adapt, plan, change. It's never going to be perfect. Things are going to happen where you wish you had done something differently, but the goal is always to make your next step better than the one before. So don't critique yourself if it's not perfect, but start looking forward to what you can do differently in the future.
Thank you, Amy. As always, that was a very informative presentation. If anybody has any questions for Amy, feel free to submit them via the chat box on your screen. You can also unmute your audio to ask your question directly.
I apologize. I made my whole screen go away. All right, I pulled up. Oh, thank you, Lisa.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Amy, I do know that one question we frequently hear is if you have examples that you can use or that you can share with others.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have sample statements that we've used in my child's IEP throughout the years that we've tweaked. So more than willing to share it out. And I think that we are absolutely able to share out slides because that was a lot of information and trying to take notes probably wouldn't have worked well. So I can share out both the slides and the some of the sample statements.
This was great, Amy. This was really helpful. Information packed.
Well, thank you. And if you'd like, what I'll do is I will also put my email address in the comments section or the chat section right now. So I'm good with emails as well.
I do have a question. Oh, Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much. Just wondering if you have, from your experience or from other families, recommendations on things to include with children who are in a more general ed environment. Just for me personally, my daughter's in 8th grade and I'm seeing that they're oftentimes pulling back what they expect of her to make it easy, even when there are things that they could handle. So just sort of finding that type of balance, if you have any tips on that.
Yeah, I think that I would really encourage them to look at what I'm sorry, I'm saying her, I'm hoping I had it right. What her behavior is telling them. So there's a difference between, a little bit of pushback when they're struggling with something versus just full-on meltdowns. So if your child's given a little bit of pushback or maybe things are a little bit difficult, if it's not something overwhelming in terms of their behavior, I would say absolutely talk about what can they do to support the learning. So where are the skill deficits? What do they need to keep pushing forward? Because certainly our kids can, I mean, my daughter actually is going to graduate with what here in New York is called a Regents diploma. It's the college bound diploma. It's the highest one they've got. But it took a lot of discussions in terms of what she needed to do to access that classroom support. So she needed to have things read to her. She needed to have some additional explanation and examples. She needed to work through things and discuss it. But what we talked about a lot was, she does better with a classroom discussion versus just listening to a presentation. She does better when someone gives her very clear examples to look at, that she can model what she's working with after that. So some of the strategies that she was taught were very much in terms of how do I look back at a passage and find the information I'm needing to restate it. So it was very skill specific. And we pushed for that. And I think those are appropriate skills to think about, just even like when you talk about, when they're adults, how do they access, what if they're going to be doing this sort of stuff, watch the news, interpret what other people are saying to them, advocate for themselves. And I think that's huge, because if you have a kid who could do very well academically, I think it's important for them to be able to identify, what do I do well? Where am I struggling, and what do I need you to do to help me get through it? So, like, for example, we've never hidden from Noelle that she has Prader-Willi, and she will absolutely tell you, I am distracted by food. I don't focus well when everybody's got it. I need you to make sure that it's not around me. Here's what you can do to make sure that works. And then she will say, I'm struggling with such and such a topic. Can you help me? And that ability to ask for help is huge, because it really pushes their learning. I mean, I think it's one of the toughest things to learn how to do is know what your own faults and flaws are and ask. I mean, we all need to learn how to do that as adults. And I think that our kids deserve the right to have somebody training them to do that as well. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
No, it does. It does. Actually, a lot of the things you said, were very helpful, I'm sure, regardless of where people fall on the spectrum. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Great. It looks like we don't have any more questions, but if anybody does have any additional questions, I believe Amy was going to put her email in the chat box, so you feel free to reach out to her directly with any additional questions. You can also ask questions on our many Facebook support groups. Feel free to contact us at info@pwsausa.org to be connected to those Facebook groups. Thank you everybody for attending tonight. Thank you, Amy, as always, for a wonderful presentation, and stay safe. Have a good night.
All right. Thanks, everyone.